Welcome back. You're watching Invest Africa. We're still exploring the private Chinese investment space in Africa, and still with me is Greg Knott. He's Director of Africa Practice at Werksmans Attorneys, and joining us now from our Nairobi bureau is Sheila Yieke. She's Director at the Kenyan Commission on Revenue Allocation on that end. Welcome to you, Sheila, and thanks so much for joining our conversation today. We were talking about the kind of investment flow we're seeing from China right now, whether or not it's lucrative for Chinese business to set up shop in Africa as such, looking at the entire cost imperative. Let's get your opinion on this. So, for example, China is a very competitive exporter. It's a net exporter of paper. Its producers are able to, with government support, I might add, manufacture paper products far more cheaply than most producers around the world. So that uneven playing field really poses a significant challenge here. It's a challenge that certainly cement producers in Kenya can identify with Chinese imports into Kenya crowding out the local market. Take us through the kind of scenario that's unfolding in Kenya specifically, and the dynamic that's currently at play when it comes to Chinese investment into the Kenyan economy.
Yes, you're quite right that Chinese are now bringing more commodities into the African continent, and this in a way is depressing the African market growth in terms of industry development, small, medium enterprise growth, and it's a great concern, you know. But as the Chinese are always seen as less averse to risk, and where they have an opportunity to bring their products, they will definitely flood the market. So the problem is about the policies of the government Africans. How much are they going to allow the commodities from China to come into their markets and flood their markets? And as you're saying in Kenya,
yeah,
right now we have plenty of private investors from China, not necessarily backed by the government. You know, they just come in and they are looking at sectors like telecommunication, you know, setting up shops. So really it's a concern that Kenya is also is looking at in terms of growth of their own economies.
What exactly is being put on the table in terms of government coming up with incentives to stimulate its own economy? Because it's a very fine line that needs to be walked here, where you've got to stimulate local investment, but you've got to be cognizant of not, saying no to foreign business as well.
Of course, we've liberalized our economy and we cannot stop them from coming, because any investor will come to your country when there is an enabling environment to carry out an investment. But what we are trying to encourage more is partnership, you know, because we also have to learn from their technology transfer. I mean, we cannot continue doing business the old way while Chinese have developed a faster, newer, most efficient way of doing business. So I guess it's a matter of, it's a delicate balance between how you can grow your economy in a developing country and taking advantage of the ones who have gone ahead, you know.
Greg, let's bring you in at this point. Is it more beneficial for business where the state plays a stronger hand, or should the state remain as a provider of an efficient regulatory system that is supportive of business?
I think business needs a good, fair referee, a good regulator of the regime. And if you've got a strong regulator, whether it's in telecommunications, whether it's in energy, wherever the case may be, then you get fair play. And if that fair play is there, then you'll get the investor looked after, and you'll also look after the business of that particular country. So look to that strong regulator. And of course, the regulator needs the policy and the regulatory framework, as was said now earlier.
Yeah.
So we've got to look to our own game.
When it comes to policy specifically, I touched on the kind of incentives that the Chinese government puts on the table for their own exporters so that they're able to compete globally. Do you see Chinese companies being able to compete without those export incentives?
Probably, because they're competitive, they're driven, innovative, and also prepared to take that risk. So I think, yes, you do find them
okay, so
engaged.
Policy or not, we've got the investment flow coming from China hitting the African continent, in a very big way here. Let's look at your opinion, Sheila, on whether or not we actually have the capacity to deal with all this investment, because ahead of the break, Glen, before we let him go, highlighting that we've got major infrastructure constraints to contend with.
Yeah, well, the fact is that the Chinese have taken advantage of the lack of infrastructure development in Africa, and they have been offering this support without even concern about how governments are governing their own country. They are more concerned about how much profit they can make, and they have made a kill in infrastructure and construction. But what Greg has said is very important regarding the regulations that man or regulate investments in the country. You know, the governments have to be sensitive, and they have to start listening to the citizens and see where the concerns are. You know, if you're going to enter into an agreement with a Chinese company in terms of construction, you must look at what kind of labor is it going to attract. Are they going to bring their own laborers to work on the road? So these are concerns that even in Kenya we tend to grapple with, and the regulations are supposed to set a framework on how you set a fair ground of operating, investor or not.
Yeah. Greg, you highlighted that policy and regulatory framework. When it comes to the infrastructural deficiencies that we boast here in Africa, I mean, they're well known. They're cited as a very big impediment to doing business, and that along with skills deficiencies,
yes.
For example. Many saying it explains exactly why foreign multinationals and enterprises in general, let alone China, have not yet seriously advanced into the continent in search of low-cost labor. So just how realistic are we being here?
Well, I think we are being realistic. I think, the core factors are that infrastructure is needed. It's going to be a long haul. I think China understands that in particular as an investor. But I think the excitement that's caught up with Africa at the moment, that will almost the optimism and the entrepreneurship that you're going to see unfold as we do in the second scramble for Africa, will overcome these infrastructural problems. That's what I see from clients. That's what I see in data. And certainly that's where we're off to. So
just to throw it out there, can Chinese investment inject some Asian tiger-like vigor in African economies? I see that, and I hope that's so. I think if one goes to the east and goes to Asia, you're caught up by this almost boundless energy. As long as Sheila says that there's a win, and what Sheila's saying and hinting at here is a win-win between the countries. If we get that relationship right, then it can only be good for the continent. So we've got to strive for that win-win. So let's take a look then at both sides of the coin here. We speak about China in Africa. What about Africa venturing into China? A few South African businesses have found lucrative avenues to explore in China itself. We've had SAB Miller, Discovery, but why is that less ventured terrain? I suppose, well, from a South African perspective, we're still, even 20 years into post-apartheid, we're still learning the ropes, as it were, into the international markets. There's that to it. There's also one's own ability and belief in one's own products and belief in one's own trade. And I think with this, as I say, the second scramble for Africa, so the confidence within the countries of Africa will grow. And with that, hopefully, will become the ability to trade, to set outside one's boundaries and one's borders. Sheila, do you think that we're underestimating our own mettle?
Yes, we are. You know, the problem with Africa is that we are not a well-regulated economy like China. China has been ahead of us. They have regulated their economies. Their licenses, permits are clearly spelled out. And when you're getting into that market, you must understand how to navigate through those permits, licenses, and those regulatory requirements. You know, so that in a way impedes Africans doing business in China, because we are not used to that kind of a well-regulated system.
Do you think that there's a willingness from the Chinese to actually accept investment from Africa, or does that have to be done on their own terms? I mean, Google and its operations immediately spring to mind.
Exactly what I'm saying. They have a well-regulated system. They've learned their economy and market, and they know what they need to do in order to protect their own. So because you have to go there and play by their rules, it becomes a bit of a barrier, but they still make it look like it's open.
Okay, your response
to that, and I think if there's a creation, I
think she is right.
If it's a creativity and innovation.
I think that's right. It is very regulated. That is a regulated society. But I think there are other cultural, language barriers which also make it difficult to set about one's business. But of course that can be overcome if you're really pushing for your particular slice of that market.
Sheila highlighting that it's a very well-regulated environment. It's something that we're not accustomed to, we're not used to, you know, and we're not familiar with. To what extent do we need to become more regulated?
Well, there's always two sides to that coin,
Yeah.
you know. I mean, business thrives as, you know, you get those entrepreneurs who say we want less regulation, we want to get business and get the markets dictate the forces, the market forces dictate what goes on. And of course, there are those who want certainty and understanding of a regulatory regime. So it's really, as Sheila also said, it's always a fine balance. We don't want to have an over-regulated society. At the same time, investors also want certainty.
Sheila also highlighted a little earlier the importance and the increasing significance of forming partnerships and alliances on Africa.
I like
so
that
let's
point.
get your
Yes,
point
I like that point very much. And I think that's what you're finding more and more with China. You've seen in the past what would be described as the Chinese menu. You know, you'd have a order the bridge, and along come with the labourers, and so on and so on, and finance, and would be described as a Chinese menu. But what you're seeing more and more now are joint venture partnerships, are more hands being reached out with firms of local knowledge or Western firms, in inverted commas. So you are seeing those joint ventures taking place more than you did in the past.
Yeah.
And that's a learning curve.
Let's take a look into the crystal ball now, Sheila, at this point. Moving forward, I mean, we've heard that China's role in Africa is said to be very dynamic. What do you see this landscape looking like and evolving to moving forward?
I think we know that the European countries who were the original investors in Africa is dwindling because of the financial crisis that they are experiencing. And more trade is being seen between Sino and African countries. I think what Africa needs to do is relook at their investment policy, because it's a new market, it's an emerging market. And if not properly framed, then somebody will take advantage of that, the emerging market of Africa. So I think Africa, in terms of coming together, you know, should look at their policy, their framework, what FDI from Asia is all about, and which areas they're going to cooperate with, you know. More and more you see China taking an MFN position in their agreements. So it means that they are now favoring China investors. So they really need to look at there's a policy shift in terms of FDI from China. And I think AU as a whole or NEPAD should sit down on the table and look at it again and see that China is actually going to have a big impact in Africa in the next 5 years. And if they're not prepared about it, then it will be a problem. They will not be able to contend with the mass import into Africa and the growth of Chinese investment into Africa.